Hello again and welcome back for another edition of London Direct. We just can't ignore it at the moment. Greece could potentially be heading for the exit door from the euro. What does that mean for the markets? Well, I've been speaking to Simon Smith from FxPro. Simon, looking at the situation with Greece at the moment, politics is always at the centre of what happens in the eurozone. Do you think that political will to make a deal succeed is there on either side?
I think it's crumbling is the best way to put it. Certainly if you look probably in the depths of the German finance ministry and some elements of the Greek political system as well, they are accepting that this is untenable and there is a case for Greece leaving. Yes, it's a difficult balance. Yes, the politics is there, but the economics ultimately comes out. The politics was in the monetary union from the beginning because it was never seen by the academics and the central bankers during the 80s you could actually create a single currency without some sort of fiscal union, and the politicians said, look, well, it's going to happen anyway. They went, oh, okay, right, well, let's try and make it as good as we can with growth and stability cap, Maastricht criteria and all that. So, but ultimately the economics is now coming back now. You've had a country that has got in a situation where it just cannot finance its debts. Normally what happens is that in that situation you see the combination of a default, a currency devaluation, and independent monetary policy would get that country going again. You've seen it in emerging markets, seen it in Argentina and Mexico, etc. It doesn't work in a monetary union, and I think that is where the economics comes back to it, and why one side, i.e. the troika, for want of a better word, are then saying, look, you need to pay back your debts, and the other side is saying, look, we can't, this is still unsustainable, we need more time to pay back those debts, even though they got that in the private sector involvement we saw 2 or 3 years ago. So the economics is, I take your point, it is about politics, but the economics is ultimately deciding their fate. Yeah,
what do you think about the way that the Greek officials have conducted themselves? They've come in for lots of criticism, but I know you're not an expert in Greek politics, but they weren't given the mandate for Greece to leave the euro. They were given the mandate to try and reform that process of renegotiating the debt. So do you think that that Tsipras can just lead Greece out of the euro without putting it to a popular vote?
You're right, they're separate issues. The issue of debt sustainability and the potential default is separate but nevertheless intertwined with that of Greece leaving the euro. And they did have the mandate in effect to negotiate, and I can take the point of the finance minister who says, and I made that point earlier on, is asking a country which can't afford its debts to take on more debt or still pay that debt over a longer period when it's just can't do it. Even when the PSI came out and you just saw, I remember doing an analysis at the time, that the way the debt burden was seen falling from about 180% of GDP to the most optimistic scenario, about 120% by 2020. And I just looked at every country around the world, OECD data, and you couldn't find one that had managed to pay down debt to that degree at that pace ever. So even at that point, at the PSI 3 years ago, too much was being asked of Greece, and so that's what they're saying. They said, look, we can't afford to pay it. The economy isn't growing enough. If you give us, if you loosen things or write down debts, yes, we can do it. But you can't. Economy isn't going to grow with such a strong fiscal grip. You're just going to kill the economy, and that's where the point they're coming from. And I have some sympathy with that, because that's just economics.
Yeah. So what happens from here? We have this deadline at the end of this month. If we do get through this deadline, do you think that Greece will stay in the euro?
If we get through, we might do in terms of the repayment. Well, it's going to be a struggle to repay the IMF what they're owed. I know a lot of sort of cash managers have gone on reserves, going central government, that they could just about do it. But beyond that, I don't see where we would go from here if there was no softening of sides and there's no meeting in the middle. There's been no sign of that in 3 months. It's the amount of effort that's been dispensed in the last 3 months for Greece is just insane. It's not a good use of everyone's time and resources within the Eurozone. The IMF has just given up so much. They've never had a country default on one of the loans, because they've lent to a country and said, right, we'll lend to you when you're in a position to pay that debt off. And they've done it when they haven't been in a position to pay that debt off. They've had concessions, and the IMF is already in a very difficult position. And I think their patience has already been shown that they've pretty much had enough. They're losing face and they're losing credibility.
Yes, we've talked about the IMF, but what about the potential impacts on the Grexit on the ECB and the European Commission? The ECB is standing to lose tens of billions of euros. And the European Commission is in an interesting position because it's meant to be fostering this European community, but at the same time, if Greece leaves the euro and potentially the European Union, then that really undermines the whole sense of community in Europe, doesn't it?
It's a good point because the whole ethos of Europe in the 70s was to bring about social greater integration, because they don't want to go back to the sort of disparity we saw that in extremis led to the Second World War. They said, what about that situation? We need to look at cooperation. We need peace in Europe, and that was the premise on which it was built. You could argue that trying to foist a single currency within that, whilst in some ways was a natural progression, in other ways perhaps was a step too far, and that you've put countries on a train which they can't stay on it, and yes, falling. There is the risk that again in extremis, that Greece falls out and then ends up in the hands of Russia to some degree. That isn't what Europe would like to see. So that's where the politics comes back into it. The economics says, look, this just isn't working. Unless you drastically reform, it's just not going to work, and Greece should go. But there's a political angle which says, there was a reason for this. And so I guess the compromise is that they do leave the single currency but somehow remain within the EU. But that could be difficult, I think, because the relationship would be fractured. It's a lot like getting divorced and say, well, you can still live in the spare bedroom. It's not really going to work in most instances. Yeah,
sure. And just to finish on the currency implications, I did an interview earlier in the week. The analyst there was saying that if Greece does leave the euro, then there'll be a lot of volatility, but after that initial volatility, then the euro will actually strengthen because all those worries are behind the euro. Would that be a theory that you would buy into?
Look, the issue is, as an analyst, you're in the unknown. This is something, so we can have a theory about it, but ultimately we don't know. And as an analyst, sometimes I'm very firm on things, but to be honest, in the situation, no one knows. And there are splits both ways. Yes, at the margins, you've strengthened the single currency if you let a weak member go. But remember, this was meant to be irreversible. This was, once you're in, you're in. There's no exit door. So now there is an exit door. And say, well, actually, we've closed it again, we bolted it up, and we've put loads of wood across it. But nevertheless, there's an exit door, and that creates a vulnerability for other nations, and then the exit door is there. So we have that interplay, and honestly, no one knows how that would play out. And you still have countries like Spain and Italy, which is slow to reform. Italy has just been growing slowly. Terrible demographics. Dependency ratio is going to rise horrendously up to 2050. Still a lot of issues going on, and that question would be there. Well, actually, this country could potentially leave now, whereas before that wasn't an issue. So, yeah, we don't know. Is honestly the answer, and it all depends on timing, but also the extent to which markets or investors then start to really base their trading or ultimately investment decisions on around that. So who's going to be in or out in 5-10 years time?
Well, thanks to Simon for his analysis of things. Stay tuned for more of the same, but from London. Goodbye for now.